After World War II, Germany was divided into four sectors by the London Protocol. In the west was the United States, Great Britain, and France. The east was controlled by the Soviet Union. In their sector was the capital, Berlin. Europe had been severed in two, just like Berlin. Eastern and Western Europe was divided between American and Soviet influence, divided between democracy and communism. This created a conflict which would not be fought with soldiers and atomic bombs. It is a Cold War fought with nerves, words, and the threat of atomic destruction. It was in the heart of Europe, Berlin, where the first battle of the Cold War began. On July 17, 1945, Joseph Stalin, President Harry S. Truman, and Clement Attlee met for the last time in Potsdam, Germany. At the conference, peace treaties were drafted with Germany's small allies, but these were not officially approved. The Allies did agree that Germany should be disarmed, and that people associated with the Nazis would not be permitted to participate in government service. Yet there was no German government, and the final peace agreement with Germany was left undecided. The Western Allies wanted democracy and a new rebuilt German government, while the Soviet Union wanted communism and a divided Germany. The American people were content with the situation at home. Soldiers were coming home and business was booming. But a speech by Winston Churchill at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri on March 5, 1946, brought attention back to problems overseas. Churchill spoke of the Soviet Union and described the growing division between Eastern and Western Europe. He said, "A shadow has fallen upon the scene so lately lightened by the Allied victory." The Allied friendship had been replaced with distrust and suspicion. Each sector did what it wanted. American aid was offered to countries that needed it. President Truman signed the Foreign Assistance Act committing American aid to Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan offered assistance to all of the countries of war-ravaged Europe. As long as they did not interfere with other countries receiving the aid, they were eligible. The Soviet Union saw the Marshall Plan as a threat to their security. The prospect of a rebuilt Germany frightened Stalin. He tightened his control over Eastern Europe. As Europe was dividing into two sides, the question of what to do with Germany became more important. The Americans offered to combine their territory with the others, but Stalin refused. The British had accepted. This unity became the foundation for a new West Germany, and the next step was to introduce a new currency. When the Soviets heard this, they rejected. A new currency meant a new country, and the Soviets wanted Germany to remain divided, disordered, and in political limbo. The new Germany that was forming with Western encouragement was a threat, and the city of Berlin, a Western outpost deep inside Soviet territory, was at the heart of the threat. When the Soviet Union withdrew their representatives from the Allied Control Council of Berlin, this marked the official division between Eastern and Western Europe. In the days before the currency reform, trains on the way to the Soviet zone from the American zone were stopped and searched. Delays like these became common, and blackouts reminded Berliners that the electrical generators were controlled by the Soviet Union. When all surface traffic was stopped, Berliners were not surprised. The Soviets had claimed it was technical difficulties, but the Berliners knew it was the beginning of a siege. The Berliners knew their fate rested on the outcome. When the news of the blockade came, the Allies did not quite know how to respond. General Lucius Clay immediately stopped all trade with East Germany. On June 24, 1948, the power had been cut off in Berlin. He had ordered cargoes of food to be airlifted into the city. He waited for President Truman's further advice. The only option that was possible was to continue the airlift and hope that it would feed 2 million Berliners. The airlift was called Operation Victuals by the press. The most challenging aspect was that 2 million people needed food, medicine, fuel, and many other products. The goal was to deliver 8 million pounds of supplies a day. The most common transport plane was the C-47, or the Dakota. It could carry 6,000 pounds of cargo. The Douglas Skymaster, or the C-54, was also used. It could carry 3 times more cargo than the C-47. The British Royal Air Force had converted the Lancaster, which was a bombing plane, to carry cargo. Crews faced many challenges that were new to the history of aviation. Berliners needed 30 tons of salt a day. That salt was hard to transport because it tore bags and ate away at the metal drums. Then the salt would rut through the control wires located in the bottom of the plane. The Allies solved this problem by using Sunderland flying boats, which had control wires in the top rather than the bottom. The pilots pushed their planes to the limit. The pilots would make their flight to Berlin from West Germany, wait for an hour for the plane to be unloaded, then return immediately. Germany was prone to fog and overcast skies, which made it difficult for planes to land. Sometimes pilots had to land on runways they could not see, given instruction by the radar-equipped ground controllers. One of the greatest limitations was the number of airports. There were only 2 in West Berlin. Gotto, which had a concrete runway, was in the British sector, was essential because the big 4-engine cargo planes could only land on strong modern runways. The American airport was Tempelhof. There was always a constant flow of airplanes in and out of the 2 airports. At Gotto, a plane took off or landed every 90 seconds. Air traffic was so dense that if a pilot overshot his landing, he could not come back for a second pass. The next plane would already be coming in to land. Although the 2 airports were operating at full capacity, the target of 8 million pounds of supplies was out of reach. The Americans and French agreed on building a 3rd airport in the French sector. With the new airport, Tegel, the original expectation had been exceeded. The airlift was a cautious and strange encounter. Both sides did not settle the matter with force. They always left their opponent with peaceful options. Neither side was ready for another war. The United States and the USSR were each afraid of each other's military advantages. The United States were afraid of the large Soviet army which could have swept through Western Europe with little resistance. The fragile democracies would easily be torn. The Soviet Union was afraid of the United States' military monopoly. The United States had developed the atomic bomb during World War II, and the Soviet Union had not yet accomplished the task. This left both sides paralyzed. Neither side was ready to make the bold move that would force the other side to respond even more bold. The Berlin Airlift was a negotiation rather than a war. The contenders each seeking an advantage, but resisting the temptation of pushing the other too hard. The Western Allies were successful in the encounter. The Soviet Union was sure the airlift would fail, so they let the flights move in and out. With the airlift's success, world opinion turned against the Soviet Union. The fact of their army attempting to starve 2 million civilians was a disaster for Soviet propaganda. While the east side of Germany was struggling, the west side was completing its constitutional convention. The new country was on the verge of being formed. The 5 members of the Brussels Treaty had now joined in negotiations with Canada, Iceland, Denmark, Italy, Portugal, Poland, Norway, and the United States. The new group was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. President Truman had signed the treaty on April 2, 1949. On May 12, 1949, the blockade was lifted, and Berliners celebrated throughout the streets. On the final day, 1,017 flights were made. The Allies made a total of 200,000 flights. They delivered 1.5 million tons of cargo, total at the cost of $5 million a day. The blockade lasted 318 days. On the day the blockade was lifted, the Allies had adopted the new West German Constitution.